Hi, all. I have a few things to say to you about interpreting the Constitution or different approaches to interpreting the Constitution. And the first thing is that there's two principles I want to say about interpreting anything. The first is that you can't escape interpretation. We have to interpret. Um, Sometimes there can be people who say, well, some people interpret and other people don't. Some judges interpret the Constitution, others don't interpret it. Well, you have to interpret it because um, it's just the nature of reading and understanding. Um, so everybody interprets, and that's not escapable. Drawing on James K.A. Smith there a little bit. But secondly, interpretation has to be defended. Okay, so not every interpretation is equally valid. Um, if I say that the dog is lying by the fence and you interpret that to mean that the aliens have landed, then that's not most likely going to be a very um, valid interpretation unless you have evidence to suggest that I'm speaking in code about the aliens or something like that. So interpretation has to be defended with evidence from the text itself or evidence about the author and the background and everything of the text to understand the text better. Okay, so that's just a couple principles here. So everybody interprets to read and understand. And then secondly, interpretation does have to be defended. It's just not a free for all. Oh yeah, every interpretation is just as good, or try to escape criticism by saying, "Oh, it's just my interpretation." Well, interpretation has to be based on something to be a valid possibility. Okay. Um, Now, what about the Constitution? Why is it important to interpret the Constitution? Well, the Constitution is, as it says in Article 6, the supreme law of the land. Um, Laws in the United States have to be constitutional, right? That's the standard by which laws are judged, okay, and actions even of the president and the bureaucracy. So laws have to be constitutional, either because the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, or because the Constitution says you can do it. Now, how exactly to apply that is certainly very debatable, controversial, and important. It's the reason why when there's a nominee for the Supreme Court these days, it is a big deal. You may remember in the last summer and fall, President Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And before that, nominated Justice Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court in 2017. And it's a big deal because the Supreme Court is the last word in our system in interpreting what the Constitution means through the power of judicial review. And so it matters who's doing the interpreting. Now, we have two different speeches in the in the articles for this week. One of them by Justice William Brennan, one of the great liberal justices of the 20th century, and the other by Justice Antonin Scalia, one of the great conservative justices of the 20th and early 21st centuries. And they are both really important in explaining very influential ways of looking at the Constitution. And they both kind of criticize each other's views as well. Now, Justice Brennan, in the one from 1986, the Constitution of the United States, a contemporary ratification, gives us one way to look at the Constitution. And his way, he looks at the goal of the Constitution, what it's intended to create, or what kind of system it's intended to create, what it's intended to produce. And I won't tell you what that is. You can look for it. But he says there's a certain goal that the Constitution has. And then what we need to do is read the Constitution in light of that goal. Okay. And Brennan was very good at explaining that view of the Constitution, very influential. And he talks about how his view applies to the death penalty toward the end of the speech. he talks about a lot of different implications of his view. Okay, so that is one influential way to read the Constitution. Think about the goal. What kind of system do the Constitution, the original one, and the amendments, the 27 amendments, point toward, and then use that as the interpretive key to understand what's constitutional and what's not. Justice Scalia, on the other hand, uses a different method. He's what's called an originalist, and he's more interested in the text of the Constitution, what each individual section means, okay, rather than necessarily looking at sort of an overall goal of the Constitution. He's more interested in what do the phrases, the clauses, the sentences, the sections mean. And then he also has a way of saying, all right, so how do I actually determine what they mean? And he talks about that. Okay. So if Brennan's looking at the goal of the whole thing, Scalia is looking at the meaning of the parts. Okay. And they both think there's significant weaknesses in the other's point of view. And of course, they think there's a lot of strength in their own point of view. So I hope this will be helpful for you to contrast their points of view. We'll get into it more deeply in class, but please also email me or get in contact with me otherwise if you have any questions. Thanks, and I'll look forward to seeing you later this week.